Hey, everybody, welcome back to The Hard Sell. I'm your host, Joel Stevenson. On The Hard Sell, we recognize that selling is hard, and so we're bringing leading experts to you to help you with whatever your sales processes are. And today we've got a very special guest, Jerry Colonna, formerly a renowned venture capitalist, and then started his own firm called Reboot, helping CEOs and founders both run a better business and build a better business and enable their organizations to I would argue, act in a much more human way than what many organizations are accustomed to doing. Jerry also wrote a book, Reboot: Leadership and the Art of Growing Up, which is a great book if you haven't read it. And also happy to report that Jerry is also my executive coach in the interest of full disclosure. So we'll try to avoid the inside jokes on this, but a few may leak out. But anyway, Jerry, welcome to the show.
Thanks for having me, Joel. And I was wondering if you're going to do the big reveal, or if I was going to have to tease out like the inside knowledge that I have. So at least now it's out of the way. So if you like what Joel does, you can thank me. And if you don't like it, you can blame him.
That's right. And now the tables are turned. So we'll hopefully have fun here for the next 20 or 30 minutes or so. One of the things that is hard about selling is rejection. Is just sort of a natural part of the sales process. And through your work with CEOs, while a CEO doesn't necessarily have the title of salesperson, there's a lot of selling that goes on, especially when you're starting a company. You're selling to investors, you're maybe selling to early employees, you're probably selling to the first handful of customers at least. And part of that is of course a lot of rejection. And so I'm curious what your experience has been to help people, especially maybe the reluctant salesperson, deal with rejection and how to handle that, overcome that obstacle to reach greater success.
Well, I think you're making a really astute observation there that so much of the challenge is dealing with rejection. And if you take a step back, I know the podcast is focused on the sales process, and I know that many of your listeners are salespeople. But the truth of the matter is we all struggle with the rejection, mostly because we attach a very deep and profound existential meaning to success. And then when we fail to achieve that success, we're kind of annihilated. And part of the way of dealing with this is to try to separate your sense of self from that accomplishment, from that goal, and to really care, because no one cares more than salespeople, right? They just care so much. But to care, to continue to care, but to not internalize that rejection as somehow a hurt against them. And I'm glad you made the point about even CEOs who don't define themselves as salespeople are in effect always selling. Whether it's for fundraising or recruiting or actually talking with potential and existing customers, we're always in that mode. So the first challenge is around the rejection. But the second challenge, and I think that this is incredibly important, is, and I've experienced this, I hate selling something I don't believe in. And we've all been sold by someone who doesn't believe in what they're selling. And it's a mutually awful experience, right? And so part of the way that I have internalized and built up the resilience to deal with the rejection is to really see myself not so much as selling myself, as much as selling that which might be the work of people I believe in. It might mean really believing in the capacity of the product or service to be of benefit to the person. and to kind of hold loosely whether or not they are accepting of that, right? And so if you take a step back, all the way back, and you say, well, what is the sales process that actually works for me? Well, it's when someone cares about me. It's when someone actually bothers to understand who I am and what my issues are. It's when someone is actually offering something that they fundamentally believe in, that they're not selling shit. And then it's that they are respectful of enough of me to hear me when I am saying no, even if they believe in their whole heart that it's going to work. Now, I think you take those two things, understanding the ability to care without being annihilated at the rejection, with that kind of other component of a process that's really about helping, and you turn what can be very difficult into something that's actually life-giving.
It's well said. We talk a lot about here on the show about a lot of people that are reluctant salespeople, particularly entrepreneur types. It's like I've hardly ever met one that when they get into a real like a real consultative conversation with someone, when they're really trying to understand their problems, it's like I think it's very it becomes very natural for someone to go into a selling mode, and like somehow you just sort of have to get yourself into those conversations, whether that's through good marketing or some outbound motion or something. But it's like if you could just get yourself to that point, then that's when actually the real sales happens anyway. All the other stuff is sort of in some sense noise. And I imagine you must have felt a little bit of that when you first started Reboot, right? Because you were doing a bit of a transition in your career to something different, and you were offering something new to the world, and there was coaching, but the way that you've sort of, I think, done it is a bit different than a lot of the standard rubrics. So I imagine there must have been people that
Yeah,
rejected in the early days.
there is a relevancy here, but there was an interim step that I think it's important to note. After I left the venture capital business, I kind of wandered in the desert, if you will, without real clear direction. And then eventually I trained as a coach, and eventually I started taking on just a few clients. And then eventually I had a very thriving solo practice. And it was during the days in which I had a thriving solo practice where, and I think a lot of coaches and consultants feel this as well, I was not just selling a product, I am the product.
Mm-hmm.
And so it was very difficult to have the product rejected and not take that rejection personally,
Mm-hmm.
for obvious reasons. And over time, what I came to understand was that since the service is the product, and this was true for Reboot, after we launched the company, we're going to be 8 years old in July. So mazel tov to us. But what I came to understand is that not every client is a Reboot client. Not just as not every client was a Jerry client, and Jerry is not the coach for every single person. And that's something that at first I had to repeat to myself over and over again, especially in the early days when I was using the experience to affirm that I had made a good choice in my life. Even though financially it was fine, I started to use that as a yardstick for my own self-worth. When I then sort of took a step back and realized that someone could be coached by me and have one experience, and be coached by somebody else and have another experience, and that other experience might be better for them, it actually lowered the stakes, if you will, and turned it back into an inquiry process, right? What's the best solution here? Later, when we launched the company, there was a basis of a number of us had already had a practice as coaches, solo coaches, But very early on, we actually wrote a document titled "What is a Reboot Client?" And it wasn't just like a product segmentation or market segmentation identification. It was, what is that ideal relationship like? And we continue to evolve that document, and we continue to use that document with people so that even in the earliest stages, if somebody signs up or reaches out for coaching, I would say a good 30–40% of the time, we point them outside of Reboot because it's not a right match. Now, we have the great good fortune of doing that. We're not grasping for every sale. But the irony is, by having that attitude, we've actually had more sales.
Yeah, we in the traditional selling markets, we oftentimes see people afraid to qualify a customer out, because as a salesperson, you have a fear of, well, my pipeline's not big enough, and so like everything that comes in, I need to close. But you end up actually oftentimes fragmenting your efforts, because you then end up spending too much time on customers that were never going to buy anyway, or if they were going to buy, they're going to churn right away. And so like that focus, I guess the ability to be willing to let something go, ultimately in the end ends up, for many salespeople that are, that sort of have gotten to the other side of this thing, ends up producing more surplus rather than that less surplus.
More surplus and deeper relationships with clients, right? And so, there's, back from my days as a investor, I'm acutely aware of the benefit of selling into an existing client base being more profitable than actually trying to expand the client base. And that is true in kind of all walks of life. It's also more satisfying, because all of a sudden you are actually contributing to and participating in whatever success the client is having. And if you can take pride in the success that the client is having, that starts to build upon itself.
If someone's going through, let's say a bad run, sometimes these things happen in, 3s or 4s or whatever, you get sort of a bunch of rejections in a row, and you've got to somehow, maybe you're taking a little bit too hard. You've got to kind of get yourself out of that mode and back into a more productive mode. What are there some techniques or tactics or, things that you've seen be successful even in your own career, or the others that you've coached?
Sure. I mean, first of all, I would say I don't consider myself an expert in the sales process at all, right? So I speak as someone who's been tangential to and contiguous with um, those processes. The first thing that occurs to me, and this won't surprise you given all the conversations we've had over the years, the first thing that occurs to me is get out of your head, go for a walk, talk to a friend, talk about what's going on. Because the worst thing that I think people do in those instances is start to ruminate and spin and spin and spin. And then they start to like parse and dissect every single interaction. And then all that gets activated is this awful self-criticism. They're really not learning something new. But if they're talking with a friend and doing the same kind of analysis, the propensity to do self-criticism and get locked in that goes down. And so hopefully you're having a peer group kind of relationship with other members of the sales team. Or if you're alone, you're reaching outside of your organization or your own traditional structure and finding additional people. You're participating in things like this blog, this podcast, and any ancillary work, so that you're having a dialogue about it. Because I think the worst human tendency is to get locked in our head. I think it was one of the Anchorman shows that Will Ferrell described himself as mind-bottled. And that mind-bottled state is it's an awful state. And the goal is to get out of that as soon as possible.
Yeah, for sure. And I think as you say, you're tangential to the process, but I think all that, everything that you just said is will it hit home to a salesperson just as it would with a CEO? So appreciate you sharing that. Maybe switching gears a little bit to the flip side of the coin. So, we sometimes have this, stereotype of entrepreneurs that sometimes is very similar to salespeople as being, a bit brash, overconfident, super outgoing, everything's always good all the time, maybe not always
Always
filtering in all
sunny in
the.
Philadelphia, right?
That's right. That's right. And so I'm curious about. I mean, I think there's good research that says positive mental attitude is actually one of the key determinants of success in sales and in many things. But I'm curious, like, at what point does it become an overused strength, and people start, when maybe overconfidence sets in?
Yeah, I think that there's a pathological positivity that can set in, and typically that's when it's a mask for an underlying negativity. So whether it's overconfidence masking insecurity, or it's brashness masking shyness, typically what you're seeing, and this is, I think, true across the board, not just for salespeople, typically what you're seeing is a compensation behavior. And that compensatory behavior, human beings can spot that a mile away. And so, what you described as outgoing, well, outgoing is perfectly fine. Extrovertedness is perfectly fine. I happen to be a profound introvert, but that's fine. When it's forced, it makes both parties uncomfortable. And, I get that there are some sales techniques that are focused on kind of presenting that way. But in the long term, if what you're trying to do is build relationships, which, to our earlier point, it's a lot more profitable and satisfying to reinforce existing relationships. If what you're trying to do is build relationships, being inauthentic is not the path. And let's just acknowledge the airplane that's flying over. Being authentic is off-putting, and or being inauthentic is off-putting. And I think the task is to find that space where you're comfortable in yourself and confident in what you're selling without bullshitting, because people can spot that. Our bullshit detectors are actually set on high, if you will.
Yeah, you have talked in the past about this concept of the loyal soldier, and how that maybe shows up. But do you mind just giving a quick kind of a 2-minute overview of that concept? And because I think it maybe has some relevance here for some folks.
Sure. So this is a concept I've actually first heard from the founder of Animas Valley Institute, Bill Plotkin, and it's a archetype used to describe a personality type, and the story comes from the somewhat apocryphal but nevertheless true story of Japanese soldiers who were holed up on islands in the Pacific during World War II. And in particular, there was one guy in the 1970s who was discovered on this island, continuing to fight the war long after the war had been over. And people will use this metaphor, we will use this metaphor to describe the parts of our personality that continue to fight the war long after the war is over, the war in our childhood. And so we continue to have belief systems that are rooted in this. And I think you're right to make the link around this. One of the challenges of being afraid of rejection is actually rooted in an early belief system which is that we have to please people in order to be safe. Or as I say in my book, love, safety, and belonging. In order to feel loved, in order to feel safe, and in order to feel that we belong, we wire ourselves to track and track and track other people and make sure that they like us. And I think you're right. There are certain positions within organizations that tend to attract that kind of people-pleasing personality. HR is one, sales is another. The challenge, and so the link here is that when my internalized sense of my own safety is dependent upon whether or not this person is pleased with me, i.e. buys the thing that I'm selling, then what happens is that loyal soldier gets really, really activated. And I might find myself, for example, saying things that are untrue, like features in a product, like capacities in the company, just to get the win. And then what gets activated is a little voice inside of our heads that says, you're a liar. You're an imposter. And then the rumination starts to begin. And so the real root there, and I think you were wise to make this connection, the real root there is that loyal soldier belief system that says that if people don't like you, then you are threatened. There's a threat. Is that what you were thinking about?
Yeah, exactly. So, if, I think for a lot of, I think especially in sales, whether you're a salesperson or sales manager all the way through to sales executive, and I would argue even a CEO trying to get your company founded, like so much of your, self-worth is like, oh, did I make the number that last month, or did I do the deal? Did I raise the round? Whatever it happens to be, there's these very, very tangible things. And one thing that I think people oftentimes like about the sales profession is it's sort of like very quantifiable. You're like, well, did you make the number or did you not make the number? Like, it's pretty obvious, but that like there is a human there's a human effect of that. Did you make the number? Did you not make the number? Like, you're good or you're not good.
Right.
It's very, versus other areas where it might be a little bit more fuzzy.
Right. There's a corollary to this too, which is, and I'll speak to the entrepreneurial founders out there. When we tilt too far into that mindset, did I make the numbers this quarter or not? Did I make the numbers this month or not? When we tilt too far into that, we run the risk of actually taking our eye off the ball of building a sustainable, durable business. We run the risk of building, what I jokingly referred to as Ponzi schemes, not businesses, right? Where, the measure of success is, say, our valuation in the company, or, in effect, the net promoter score, to just pick one of a bazillion, metrics. Whereas those things are important and they contribute, but the goal remains building a durable, sustainable business that has a tomorrow, not just a today. When a healthy, functioning sales process understands that and internalizes that, they see that team will see themselves as contributing to build a durable, sustainable business. Not just what is my metric that I'm trying to hit, but what is our collective goal? What are we trying to do here? And, yes, we may be driving the top line, but if we drive the top line without paying attention to the bottom line, we run the risk of, making up for those losses in volume. And that's a joke. Of course, you can't do that. So, at a time, especially now with the markets in free fall and so much tumult going on in the market, to just remember that we're all in this for one particular reason: build a durable, sustainable business. As my grandfather used to say, my grandfather, the entrepreneur, make sure that there's more money at the end of the day than there was at the beginning. Like that's our goal.
And if you're, say, a sales leader in a younger organization, and you've got some of these pressures coming, and things especially going to be magnified now, and you're trying to figure out how to have that conversation with the CEO about like, hey, the numbers aren't right anymore, or like you're asking, me to do something that's maybe not in the best, like how do you think somebody should approach having that sort of real conversation with the CEO?
Well, I'll tell you what I would always do on the board when I sat on the board is, and I do this even now as CEO of the company. And I tell all of my colleagues I do this. When a spreadsheet is presented to me, or when a spreadsheet was presented to me, I would stare at it and I would ask myself, what's the story in the spreadsheet? Right. So in a similar fashion, if you have, like if you have a close rate that's dropping, there's a story there. If you have if you're gathering feedback on pricing or features, there's a story there. And too often we myopically look at the numbers and overlook the story. And the story is what really matters, right? So we use the data and the details to tell us a story about the business, right? So year over year growth, what's happening there? When we look at the individual company numbers or the individual product line numbers against a backdrop of macroeconomics, right? There are stories in there. And I think leadership's job is to suss out what the story is being told. Well, to create a story about the vision, but also to figure out what the story is in the numbers, right? And what's important here is that sometimes what seem to be outwardly good numbers are in fact telling us a story that's a negative story. It might be a declining margins. It might be a longer and longer close time. All of that needs to be tracked and understood so that you're staying close to the customers.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, I think oftentimes salespeople are good at the narrative aspect, and so I think trying to think about, what's a story versus like fighting over like this number or that number is a great way to think about that.
Yeah.
So, well, Jerry, we could probably go on for hours and hours, as we sometimes do in our sessions, but we're gonna have to wrap things up here. So, if people want to learn more about your work at Reboot, or check out the book or anything else that you're doing, what's the best way for people to do that?
Reboot.io is the website, and pretty much everything there is to know about us, including the book and, signing up for courses, signing up for different resources. It's all available on the website.
Yeah, it's great. Great resource. And I would argue, especially as the sort of the tide starts to go out now and all the bullshittery that's out there is starting to be exposed, I think the message in the book and what you guys are doing is more relevant than ever. So encourage people to go to reboot.io and check that out. So, well, Jerry, thanks very much for being on the show today.
Thanks, Joel. Thanks for having me, and best of luck today.
Thank you.